For all the people who have been regulars to my Parsha Shir, so I want to begin by saying that we were actually scheduled to resume the Parsha Shir, Parashat Bereshit, exactly a month ago. And at that time, at the last minute, we decided to reschedule because exactly a month ago on Wednesday, I had a cataract operation. And I thought it wouldn't be a great idea for me to give a shir after my operation because I didn't know how I'd be feeling. Little did I know that on that very same day, that my wife would be admitted to the hospital and that this would become the beginning of a process that would radically change my life. For the people who have listened to my podcasts in the past, Parashat Chaye Sarah is usually the parsha that I dedicate to my father's memory. In fact, today, right, although it's already the next day according to the Hebrew calendar, was my father's 25th yortzeit. But tonight, I am clearly dedicating this shiur to the memory of my beloved wife, Malka. And in fact, some of the points which I'm going to be bringing up tonight are things which I've never discussed in my podcasts or in other shiurim that I've given. So it seems that there's always something new to learn from Torah. Before I begin the shir, I would also like to acknowledge the passing a number of days ago of two great pillars of the Jewish people, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs and Rav David Feinstein, each in their own way had a major impact on world Jewry and perhaps beyond. I am sure that over the coming days and weeks and months, there will be many, many people who will be eulogizing these two giants. But tonight, in the spirit of our parsha, which is Chaye Sarah, which essentially speaks, at least in the beginning, of the death of Sarah. It speaks about how Abraham comes to eulogize his wife and to cry. So that for my wife, it is perhaps the most appropriate thing that I should be the one to speak about her. I will try to contain myself and not to cry, but I never know when it may come out. My essential crying actually happened a number of weeks ago after her first operation, and I may speak about that a little bit later. I attached a source sheet where most of the sources are in Hebrew. So I apologize to people who have difficulty with Hebrew sources. But there's one source in particular, a comment by Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, that I attached. It's in the Hebrew, but I also photocopied a page in the English, which will actually be a central part of the shir. So you can follow along if you have it, if you didn't download it, so you could look at it later on, because I will essentially go through what he says, explain it, although I think it's pretty self-explanatory. So without any further ado, in podcasts which I've given over the years, so I've said it's always very interesting that there are two parshiot that speak of life, but in fact really revolve around somebody's death. We have in our Parashat Chaye Sarah, which immediately tells us about the death of Sarah. And then we have at the end of the book of Breshit, Parashat Vayechi. And in fact, there are many, many parallels between these two parshiot. And I want to begin with a comment. If you have my source sheet, it's number 2, if you want to follow. But if not, so I'll simply mention it. A comment made by a classic medieval commentator on the Chumash, Rav Yosef Bechor Shor, who lived in the 1100s and was part of what is generally known the school of Rashi. Okay, and perhaps very much influenced by the Rashbam, the Pshat people. And he notes something which I'm sure, especially nowadays, especially in Pardes, is something which does not go unnoticed. And that is that the Torah rarely discusses the death of a woman. Even women who are righteous, there is hardly any mention about their deaths. And then in those few situations where we describe the death of someone, of a woman, it usually is because there's something that's somehow connected with their death, which is really what interests us. And in this particular case, and I've certainly spoken about it a number of times in podcasts, essentially we're discussing the death of Sarah because it really is a segue to all of the negotiations that go on between Abraham and the Hittites to purchase the cave of Machpelah, which essentially is the first purchase of land in Israel, which is the beginning of the actualization of the promise which God makes to Abraham, that he will take possession of this land, so that in a certain way, talking about the death of Sarah is kind of incidental. It's instrumental in order to be able to get to what really matters, so to speak. And what really matters is to talk about Ma'arat Machpelah. But tonight, I don't want to look at it that way. Tonight, I want to actually focus on the death of Sarah as being something which the Torah wants to actually mention in its own right. And not only to mention the death of Sarah, but through the death of Sarah, or to be able to somehow put in perspective the life of Sarah. And therefore, what I would like to do is to begin, if you have again my source sheet, with number 3, Rashi, the first Rashi on the Parsha, which I'm assuming many people here are very familiar with, where Rashi comments on the language of the first pasuk. And I say this right out today, even though, and some people might question it, but even though I normally tend to try to look at what is the pshat of the pasuk, today I'm going to be entering much more the realm of drash. And I'm not necessarily going to an analysis of, how does that exactly fit in? And does it really fit in? Is it necessary to say this? But I want to look through the lenses of the rabbis, through Chazal. What is their understanding of who Sarah was? And so Rashi brings the famous drash, where it says that Sarah lived 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. And why do we mention each time the word shana? And therefore, Rashi brings the drash which says, this comes to teach us that when Sarah was 100 years old, she was like a woman of 20. And when she was a woman of 20, she was like a woman of 7. With respect to what? Well, when she was 20, which is the age, according to the rabbinic understanding, by the heavenly court, when people become accountable for what they do, right? Where we could say that they've now become mature adults and then become fully responsible for their actions. So in the same way, when Sarah was 20 years old, at the first moment when you could say she was responsible for what she does, accountable for what she does, she was without sin. So too, when Sarah reached the golden age of 100, she was also without sin. How is 20 like 7? In the same way that at 7, she was beautiful. At the age of 20, she was beautiful. So I want to begin actually with the second drash. It's interesting that the Chizkuni, who is again a medieval commentator, who was from the school of Rashi, and very often elaborates on comments which Rashi makes, he says the following: what do I mean when she was 20? She was like 7 in terms of her beauty. So, by the way, I don't know how much this might be relevant today, although I think it's still relevant. But he makes the comment saying that in the same way a 7-year-old does not put on makeup and has what we would call, right, this is my paraphrase slightly, and has this natural beauty, so too, when Sarah came to be the age of 20, when it is very common for women to put on makeup, that wasn't her thing. She didn't do it. She just had this natural beauty which radiated. I want to put that on hold for a moment, but I just want to make the comment. If nothing else, so it at least says to us something about Sarah from the rabbinic perspective. What we would call today authenticity, what we would call today, okay, something which is just natural, no frills attached. That is what Sarah reflected in her beauty. It was just so authentic, so real. There was no need for her to have to embellish it. And perhaps the other side of the coin, and she felt no need to do it. She felt no need to have to be alluring. One might even say provocative. That's the first drash that I want to look at in terms of Sarah. Who was she? Somebody who was beautiful, which we already know from the text, right? From we go back to chapter 12 in Breshit, when Abraham has a conversation with Sarah, which we know from the fact that she was taken twice by 2 kings. And yet what this is saying about her, which for me is much more significant, is about her authenticity, of her natural tendency, of her not putting on airs, of not having a need to somehow embellish herself. Now I want to look, I'll come back to the other drash, about 120, We'll come back to that later on with Rabbi Samson Hirsch, so I'm just going to leave it for the moment. But I want to look at, if you have again number 3, down below it says, Shnei Chaye Sarah. And Rashi makes the comment, the fact that we repeated the years of the life of Sarah, Kulan Shavin Litova. All of her life, all of her years were equal in good. And what I have quoted afterwards in brackets is a midrash, a relatively not so well-known midrash, Seichel Tov, which says the following comment, which presumably is where Rashi is drawing from. Shekach hayta chayeha, this was her life. V'kulan avru b'simcha u'v'sason. Rashi says all of her days were good. But it's interesting in the Midrash that it doesn't say good, but it says in happiness, in joy. There was something about her life that gave her a sense of fulfillment, a sense of satisfaction, of being able to take it all in, and yet nevertheless to be happy. And I thought about this because if you look actually at what we have in the text, it's really very interesting. You know, the first thing that we actually learn about Avram, when he's Avram at the end of chapter 11 in Breshit, we learn about who his father is, we learn about who his brothers are, and then we learn about the fact that he got married to Sarai. And then what does it tell us? Vatihi Sarai akara ein la valad. Sarai is barren. She has no child, right? It's a way of really sticking the point, right? In other words, she has no children. And this fact that she's barren, which is in contrast, presumably, to many other women who were around at the time, and especially living in a context where to a great extent, okay, your identity is very much associated with your ability to have children. So I would imagine that she was not necessarily such a happy camper, right? Okay, being barren. And not only that, but when we look later on in the Tanakh, right? The famous story of Hannah. Okay, we see that, in other words, the fact that she's not able to have a child or was something that was very painful to her. She even cries out against God. She breaks down in tears. And if I take this rabbinic statement for the moment seriously, then the rabbis are saying that, well, yes, she was barren, but somehow she nevertheless was able to still find happiness in her life. We know even later on in the Chumash, Rachel comes to Jacob and she says, give me children, if not, right? Why do I need to live? So it's a very interesting take which the rabbis have on Sarah, that despite the fact that there may have been elements in her life which could have been very traumatic, which could have resulted in a tremendous amount of bitterness, yet somehow she was able to live her life in happiness. I'm focusing on the fact that she was barren. We know, as I mentioned earlier, twice she was taken by 2 kings. Okay, and only at the last minute, because of divine intervention, she was saved from them. Let alone the fact that here is Avram, who uproots her from her birthplace, from her family, to take her to some place way off. And there could have been, again, many, many reasons for her to be bitter against God, to be bitter with her husband. And yet, according to this rabbinic understanding, she accepted, and not only accepted it, but was able to somehow live a life filled with happiness and joy. And perhaps I want to now comment on something which also we know from the text, but maybe now that, you could always, some people I know will always be a little bit cynical and say, oh, the rabbis are reading all this into the text, and, and it's maybe they have some agenda, I don't know. But, the element of laughter comes up with Sarah. It's very interesting. She laughs twice. Both of them connected with the birth of her son. The first time in last week's Parashat, when she hears indirectly that she is going to give birth to a son, she chuckles. Vatitzchak Sarah b'kirba. She laughs inside. She kind of is a little bit astonished, wondering. And in fact, when God gets a little bit, it would seem to be a little bit upset, and he doesn't even talk to Sarah. He talks to Avram and says, why did Sarah laugh? And then she's confronted. And she says, no, I didn't laugh. Why? Because she was afraid to acknowledge that. That was the first time she laughs. But then the second time she laughs is after Yitzchak is born. And it doesn't say she laughed. She says, Tzchok asali Elokim. This is in chapter 21 in Bereshit. Tzchok asali el, God has given me laughter. Kol hashomeya yitzchak li. Anybody who hears about what just happened, and here there are two ways you can translate it, will laugh at me and say, boy, this is hysterical. Here is Sarah, right? This old lady who just had a baby. Or the way it's understood by the rabbis, Kol HaShomei Yitzchak Li, anybody who hears about this will laugh with me. And what I would like to say is that perhaps what characterized Sarah is, at the birth of Yitzchak, then we see maybe who Sarah is. We see, which is somebody who laughs, somebody who's able to rejoice. And the laugh that she has is infectious. When people see her joy, they laugh. They share in that joy, which means that she is somebody who's able to bring laughter, joy to the world around her. For many years I taught Parashat Lech Lecha. In chapter 17, when God tells Abraham of the birth of a son that he's about to have, and tells him, you should call him Yitzchak. So I would always say, well, why is he being called Yitzchak? He will laugh. Well, that's to commemorate the laughter of Abraham, which occurs earlier in that section in chapter 17, when God tells him he's about to have a son, and he falls down and he laughs. And Rashi brings the rabbinic comment which says that this is a laughter of joy. And so that laughter is now becoming commemorated, perpetuated with the name Yitzchak. But now what I want to say is that it's not just about Abraham's laughter. and maybe even more so about Sarah's laughter. Because maybe Sarah, even more than Avraham, is the symbol of laughter. And now I want to speak about something which appeared also in last week's Parsha. Sarah sees Ishmael mitzachek, laughing. And on that basis, she says to Avraham, you need to expel him. And Avraham is not happy about that. And then God says to Avraham, listen to Sarah. Whatever she tells you, listen to her voice. And Rashi quotes a rabbinic comment which says, from here we derive that Sarah was a greater prophetess than Avram. That she somehow knew the will of God more than Avram. And in effect, God is saying to Avram, this is the will of God. And what I would like to suggest now is, there are many explanations as to why is Ishmael laughing and what is so problematic about it. And I want to suggest, or I want to bring what Rashi says there, which would seem to be the pshat. Ishmael, when he's laughing, is taunting Isaac. Ishmael is saying to Isaac, I will be the heir. In a way, it's a laughter, which is threatening, which is ridiculing. And Sarah sees that. And therefore, Sarah says, get rid of Ishmael. I'd phrase it even differently. There isn't any room for that type of laughter. Ishmael is mitzachek in the present tense. Isaac is Yitzchak, the one who will laugh. Or as we would say in English, the one who laughs last, laughs best. But it's not just that Isaac will have the last laugh. Isaac will have the laugh of his mother, which is not a laugh of ridicule, which is not a laugh which is threatening, but it's a laugh which is embracing. It's a laugh which brings joy not only to her, but to all around her. And perhaps this is what Isaac also embodies in his life. The ability of bringing that type of laughter to the world around him. If I go on to reference number 4, which is a midrash, which again is looking at the first pasuk in our parsha. In Breshit Rabbah, it quotes a verse from Tehillim which says, God knows the days of the Tmimim, and their inheritance, their heritage, will be forever. And the midrash on the second line, which I have there, says, what does it mean God knows the days of the Tmimim? This is a reference to Sarah. Sarah, who was Tmima b'ma'aseha. And I purposely did not translate the word Tamim. And there are two ways that you can translate it. One way is complete. And then what the rabbis are saying is, Sarah was complete in her actions. One could say a perfectly righteous individual in every way. Another way of taking the word tamim is innocent, simple, straightforward. And by the way, the same word, although not the word tamim, but tam, we know appears by Noach. Noach is described as Noach, ish tzaddik, tamim haya bedorotav. He was tamim too. Which would then bring up a very interesting analogy between Sarah and Noach. And I once spoke about this in one of my podcasts. What characterized Noach was a certain straightforwardness. It was like, if this is what needs to be done, then this is what I'm going to do. If this is what's right to be done, then this is what I'm going to do. Noach was somebody who we could say today does not deviate to the right or to the left. He sees things as it is. He's a tzaddik. Whatever he's told to do, he does. It's interesting the connection between the two explanations of tamim. The idea that I'm somebody who is straightforward, who just takes things as they are. And in today's society, right, we might have the tendency to say simplistic, simple-minded, not sophisticated. But there's a flip side to that. Sometimes we tend to be overly sophisticated. We tend to not do what we need to do or what's right to do, and find all kinds of ways of rationalizing it, justifying it. And yet that's not the way Noach was. And what I would suggest is, and that's also not the way Sarah was. Sarah was somebody who looked at things, and if this is what seemed to be, what should be the right thing to do, then she would do it. And perhaps this is also why you could say she was complete in what she did. Because by and large, she would hit on what are the right things that need to be done. Because it's very easy to go off the path, so to speak, and rationalize it. So now I would like to come to the take which Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch has on this very first verse. And I'm just trying to show you one verse. It's interesting to see how all these commentaries explained it and to see what was their understanding of Sarah Imenu. And I think Rabbi Hirsch starts with the same basic elements, but takes it to a whole other level. And so now I'm going to read to you from what he writes, rather than summarize it, because I think it's actually very, very beautiful. And I also sent this as part of my source sheet. I see that some people had problems, not necessarily getting it. Anybody who has that, we will see that you get it. So let me start reading. He's essentially commenting on what the Midrash which Rashi brought up, about 127. And he says, here the life of Sarah is presented in 3 age groups. Let us take it then as is clearly presented to us. And thus we are told, not that Sarah lived 127 years, but 100 years, 20 years, 7 years. These 3 numbers represent to us the 3 periods in the development of a human life. The age of childhood, mature youth, completed old age. So what Rabbi Hirsch takes from this pasuk is the Torah is essentially delineating 3 periods in Sarah's life, which in fact are 3 periods, hopefully, in everyone's life. Childhood, what he calls mature youth, and what we would call old age, but it's interesting, he uses the language completed old age. And then he goes on to say the following: a spiritually and morally perfected life could not be better expressed than, as an old man, he was old. As a man, a man. As a child, a child. What does he want to say with that? Which I think is very, very interesting. We go through different phases of life. How much is it that in each phase of our life, we are very much in tune with that phase? How much is it that we live that part of our life to its fullest? When I'm a child, how much is it that I take advantage of what it is to be a child? One might say to be spoiled, to be able to get to do anything that I want, to not be maybe intimidated, inhibited by anything. And then when I go on to the next stage, when I become a youth, but what he might call a mature youth, where all of a sudden I become much more sophisticated, where all of a sudden I begin to realize things, where all of a sudden I'm at a point to take responsibility. Okay, since I saw Jennifer wrote down, to be a child is to be able to be irresponsible, to be reckless. But then I go on to the next stage, where at least the assumption is that now I am going to be somebody who is responsible, who does take control of my life, who does try to accomplish, who has a tremendous amount of energy, and to experience that to its fullest. To have all these drives and to actualize them in the best way possible. And then at the end, old age. To what extent is it? And I can certainly now speak for myself. Then when you reach what's called, the golden years, right? The next phase in your life, right? To what extent do you realize, okay, and Dov, thank you, Dov, full age, because that's what Rav Hirsch says. To what extent do you say to yourself, I'm not a 20-year-old. I'm at a different stage. But nevertheless, there's still a lot which I can accomplish at this stage of my life. And not only that, and here is where Rav Hirsch goes on, and I'll just try to now summarize what he says. It's not only appreciating each phase of your life and being in tune with that phase of your life and maximizing it, but how do you then take each stage and continue it in the next stage? Continue it, but then adapt it, recognizing where you are. How is it that you remain a child even when you're in old age and maintain somehow the beauty of what you had when you were a child? How is it that in old age you take a certain vitality that you had, but now somehow adapt it to the new situation, so that in the end, it's not only living each phase to its maximum, but it's integrating them, so that each stage builds on the next, each stage incorporates the next. And if you have Rabbi Hirsch, I'm going to skip to the next paragraph. All these years are called Chaye Sarah. She lived in all of them. The whole of her 127 years existence was a life, a lively, cheerful, important, good life. No moment of it that she would have had to wish not to have been there. This is how he interprets all of her years were for good. She lived a full life. She lived every moment to its maximum. She never looked back and regretted and wished she should have, and could have done something else. And she was able to integrate every phase of her life to move from one phase to the next phase. And therefore, what I would like to say is perhaps this is why the parsha is called Chaye Sarah. Because Sarah had the secret of what it means to live, of what it means to value your life, of what it means to live every moment to its maximum, to be able to rejoice with every moment, to not look at the issues, the difficulties, and let them bog you down, but to somehow be able to always put a positive twist on things. This is her greatness. I want to move on to number 5, in what I have. And that is the Alshich, Rabbi Moshe Alshich, a Kabbalist in Tzfat, in the golden age of Tzfat, in the 1500s, a student of Rav Yosef Karo, a teacher of Rav Chaim Vital, who is perhaps better known as being the student of the Ari Kadosh, the student, who's buried in Tzfat and who has a commentary on the Chumash. And everyone knows that this is not necessarily my thing, Kabbalah, but maybe in my old age, and I said it, that this is something which I'd like to pursue much more. And I think his comment over here, we're not going to go into what might be seen as, esoteric, Kabbalistic, ramifications, but simply take it on a more down-to-earth level. And what does he say in his commentary? So he says, Achine yadanu mechachmei ha'emet. We know from the scholars of truth, which is the term that's used for the Kabbalists, those who know the secrets of the Torah. Ki Avraham v'Sarah ba'u litaken et asher ivtu Adam v'Chava. That Avraham and Sarah came to correct that which Adam and Eve had corrupted. And then he goes on to give point by point the things which Adam and Eve did, which were very problematic, and to in effect show how Avraham and Sarah corrected it. And I have a line which I put in bold print, which I think, again, is very much part of the theme which I'm trying to develop. He says at a certain point, Ki Adam v'Chava heviu mita la'olam. Adam and Eve brought death into the world. Okay, and we all know God told Adam, and again, I'm not going to get into the whole question about who did God speak to and who did what and who's guilty and who That doesn't matter to me right now. God told Adam and Eve, do not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The day that you eat from it, you will die. And although they didn't die immediately, but they brought into the world a concept of death. And then what he says is, Va'avraham v'Sarah heviu chayim la'olam. They brought life back into the world. And maybe I would add just a little bit. If as a result of eating of the tree of knowledge, all of a sudden there's this concept of death which enters the world. But it's not only death. There's also the idea of hostility, of enmity. There's the adversarial relationship between people and the snake. You might take this in terms of the animal world. There's an adversarial relationship between people and nature, between the land. By the sweat of your brow, you'll eat bread. Thorns and thistles will grow from the ground. All of a sudden, what should have been a harmonious reality is now filled with tension, with tremendous contention. Even what Eve is told about the sadness she'll experience in giving birth. Adam is told about the sadness of eating. Abraham and Sarah are bringing into the world a new reality, a reality which promotes life. And given what I said before, a reality which promotes laughter, a reality which is promoting harmony, which is seeking harmony. And now I want to say something which I think you can see throughout the Parshiot of Abraham and Sarah. Although Abraham is told Lech Lecha, and although we always speak about the journey which Abraham is embarking on, we talk about the 10 trials of Abraham. And inevitably, I always have the Pardes students who are always upset about the fact, why is it we're always talking about Abraham? Why don't we talk about Sarah? Where is Sarah? Yes, we do talk about Abraham, but the fact is, everything which we speak about Abraham, Sarah is a major player. Sarah is Abraham's soulmate, is his partner in his life's mission. From beginning to end, she accompanies him on all of his journeys. When God tells Abraham, I will make you a great nation, and where God says to him, I will give you a child. In chapter 17 in Breshit, when the covenant is finally made, God makes it very clear. The child of the covenant is not the child of Abraham. It's the child of the couple of Abraham and Sarah. Everything which Abraham is working towards is not just his mission, it's their mission. She is a full partner in everything he does. And their partnership is to create a different reality. To create a reality which puts on the pedestal life, the actualization of life, the enjoyment of life, the laughter in life. This is who Sarah is. She is Abraham's life partner. Someone said, but Sarah doesn't participate in the Akedah. That's true. She doesn't participate in the Akedah. And I think I mentioned in a previous shir that Abraham and Sarah each impact on Yitzchak, each in a very different way, each in a complementary way. Sarah is the one who gives Yitzchak laughter. Sarah is the one who's embracing, who's protective, who does everything for this child to create a framework where he will feel completely loved. Abraham introduces him to a different reality. A reality which perhaps can be very, very painful. And yet which perhaps he also needs to embrace. And I might even say to brace himself for. And what Avram shows him, and this is something which certainly comes up in rabbinic literature, in quite a few midrashim, is how to serve God with love. Even when what God is asking you to do can be very, very painful. It is also an approach which highlights the positive, so that Yitzchak receives from both of his parents, each in their own way, the sense of joy. Joy in the day-to-day, joy even when you're confronting things that are very, very painful. Joy in your relationship with the people around you, joy in your relationship with God. So what I would like to do now is just to say a few things about my wife, Malka, my dear wife, Malka. At the funeral, my brother-in-law said she had a full life. And she did. I knew her for 62 years out of her 69 years. We knew each other. We knew each other from grade 2 in elementary school. We were married for over 48 years. And I will be the first one to attest to the fact that she lived her life to the fullest. She had a tremendous joy, a laughter. Anybody who knows her, and you can even see it on the picture that was on the screen before, which is one of the last pictures that we took together, courtesy of Pardes. She's smiling, and she's smiling in what was her environment, in a garden, our garden, her garden. Nature always put a tremendous smile on her face. And from the hundreds and perhaps thousands of people who we heard from, who greeted her, the first thing which everybody says is she always smiled. She always made us feel welcome. My Malka was not like Sarah. She wasn't barren. She was given a tremendous gift to be able to bring children into the world. For those of you who don't know, we have 9 children. We have almost 30 grandchildren. Every time she became pregnant, every time she gave birth, it was with a smile. She embraced it. The Gemara talks about how a woman who gives birth brings a sin offering. And the reason for that is because it could be that in the pangs of childbirth, with all the difficulties of childbirth, she has second thoughts about whether it was worth it to bring children into the world, whether it's worth it to continue to bring children into the world. My Malka would just breathe deeply when she had contractions. In contrast to many people around her, she wouldn't scream. She wouldn't be bitter. She would somehow embrace her pain with a smile. She would never have second thoughts, never even imagine not having children and seeing the tremendous, and she would always see the tremendous blessing in having children. So it wasn't just that she was able to appreciate every moment of her life, but literally she brought a tremendous of life physically into the world. She brought a lot of laughter into the world. After our children grew up, we discussed that it would be a good idea for her to perhaps do things outside the house. And she decided to become a librarian. And at first we said, or I said, well, it was a natural fit. She loved reading books. It would just be perfect for her to be spending her whole time in a library. But little did I realize then, which I only came to realize in recent years, her love of books was actually instrumental in developing relationships with all the children in all the schools that she worked in. Her library was not just a place where people would come to read books. It was a place where people came to see Malka, to share her smile, to share her embrace, to be given words of encouragement. Unfortunately, sometimes in the system, there are kids who don't fit in. There are kids who don't necessarily get the best treatment from their teachers. But she was somebody they could always turn to. She was a teacher. She was an advisor. She was a mother. I want to end with actually the first reference on the page. I mentioned earlier the connection between the two Parashiot. Parashat Chaye Sarah, Parashat Vayechi, which speaks about the death of Yaakov. So first, I just want to note something which I think is interesting. By Sarah, it says Vayechi Sarah, she lived, and then it tells us 127 years. By Yaakov, the parsha starts out by saying he lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. And what I would say is that Yaakov wasn't Sarah. Yaakov had a very painful life. And I might even say most of his life, he was not a happy camper. He only came to life in the last years of his life when he was reunited with Joseph in the land of Egypt. But what I want to comment on, and please excuse me for going over my time, but I had actually mentioned to Simon that there was that possibility that I would go over, and if anyone feels like they need to go, so please go. You shouldn't feel obligated to stay. But I want to end with this last point. In chapter 48 in Breshit, we're told that Jacob became ill. And then Jacob called his son Joseph. At that point, he blessed Joseph's two sons, and then eventually all of his sons gathered around and he blessed them as well. And in the first reference on my page, it says that until the time of Jacob, this is a quote from the Gemara Masechet Baba Metzia, until Jacob, there was never a situation of somebody who became sick and then died. In fact, in that context, how did people die? They would essentially sneeze, and then their soul would depart from their body, which essentially is the reason why when people sneeze, people will say la briut, to your health, or gesundheit, as a way of somehow, because at one time, that was actually seen as being potentially a very dangerous thing to sneeze. Because you sneeze and that's it. Your life just departs. But Yaakov, according to the Gemara, was the first one who's described as being sick before he died. And the Gemara says Yaakov actually asked to be sick. And Rashi has two explanations why Yaakov asked to be sick. One explanation that Rashi gives in that Gemara, in Baba Metzia, is that Yaakov wanted to be sick so that he knew the time was coming, so that he can give his final will and testament to his children. And in Masechet Sanhedrin, Rashi says something else, which is, by being sick, It gave his children the opportunity, the time, to be able to gather together so that they would all be there when he died. And in the past, I've always spoken about this, and perhaps this is also a very important concept at how you look at death. That rather than seeing death as being somehow a break, see death as somehow being a closure. There's a very interesting drash in chapter 5 of Breshit where it says, Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam. This is the book of the generations of man, which then goes on to give the listing of all the generations and how long everybody lived, right? Which essentially is telling us the history of humanity, a timeline. But that pasuk can also be understood to be saying, every person's life is a book. Every stage of your life is a chapter in that book. And to a great extent, what is the book that you're leaving to future generations? To what extent is that there is a closure to that book, a closure to one's life? And this is what Yaakov wanted to do, and this is Yaakov's greatness. In his death, he brings a closure to his life. And so I want to share with you what actually happened with my Malka. I mentioned that a month ago, she was hospitalized. The reason that she was hospitalized was because since Rosh Hashanah, she had difficulty when we would go walking. And once I unofficially retired, which was the beginning of the summer, and essentially stopped really in practice teaching, we would go walking every day. And not only that, but again, as part of who she was, because she so much wanted life, she always was very careful, and she was so straight. She was always very careful to always be fit. She was always careful to always eat healthy. And I use this language, she would drive me crazy. You have to walk, because she wanted me to live. And when I finally retired, she was ecstatic, because every day I would go walking, and I would go walking with her. It was a double benefit. But on Rosh Hashanah, that began a certain process where she had difficulty when we would go up a hill. And thank God in Efrat, there are lots of hills. And when it happened, not just once, but a number of times, I said to her, you have to check this out. And when she went to the hospital exactly a month ago, they checked it out. And they discovered that she had completely clogged arteries. When I say completely, like 99%. And the doctors were in total shock, because the doctors could not make a correlation between the woman who was in front of them, who looked completely healthy, who I will say was about to be 70 years old, but looked like she was 50 or maybe even 40. I didn't mention this earlier, but to me, she was always beautiful. To me, I always was opposed, and even though she rarely did it, but I was opposed to her putting on any type of lipstick, makeup, because she just radiated this natural beauty. And then to see someone like that, and how could it be? Somebody who has this medical situation shouldn't be looking like that. And unfortunately, she had to undergo a bypass operation. And I won't go into the details, which was not successful. And essentially, there was a period of a week after she had her operation where she was in critical condition, where we, the family, were like on a roller coaster going from despair to tremendous hope. But what do I want to bring out with this? Malka's death was really the closure of her life. And in her death, whoever she was in her life came to its fullest expression. The way she died was what Yaakov asked for. She was sick. She gave us a week to be able to somehow take in the fact that she might die, so that it wasn't a complete shock that would have been absolutely devastating. But we had a week to somehow absorb it. We had a week to be able to somehow bring closure, to be able to say to her how much she meant to us. And although she was under sedation, we would talk to her, and there were various times where we noticed that she was responding. Even in her death, she did it in a way which made it easier for us to continue living. She died on a Friday at 1:00. Friday morning, I got a call from the hospital saying that we should all come because the situation was deteriorating. For 4 hours, all of her children, spouses, her brother, without exaggeration, we were in intensive care. There were, at the end, 25 people around her bed. We sang to her. Each child, each spouse of a child said goodbye to her. At the very end, we all got together. We said vidui. And then her soul departed quietly. During the whole period, she, from my perspective, did not experience pain. If anything, she experienced the embrace of all of us around her. In the same way she lived her life, peacefully, she left peacefully. She enabled us to go on living. The last point which I just want to make, which for me is extremely important. Malka is not somebody who was ever in the newspapers. It's probably somebody that the newspapers would not be interested in writing about because they would probably see her life as being boring. She was not somebody who had all these degrees, who had all these titles, who had all these awards. And yet, for me, she is somebody who is a tremendous hero, a tremendous role model, who I think we can all learn from of what it means to really live your life, of what it means to be able to maximize every moment of your life, of what it means to bring life into the world, of what it means to give people a reason to live for. Yes, as I see a comment on the screen, she was my Malka. She was a Malka. Not because she imposed herself, not because she sought to be a Malka. She was a Malka by the sheer beauty of her smile, ingratiated herself to so many people who looked to her as someone to emulate. May her memory always be a blessing to all of us. And I will at least say for myself and for my children, as much as we knew her, unfortunately, we never appreciated the magnitude of who she was. Now, unfortunately, we do. And this is what we take with us further, as perhaps a kind of closure to the Parsha, which went to such, where the rabbis went to such great lengths to speak the praises of Sarah. After we buried Malka, just before Shabbat, and I was very insistent that it was very important for me that she should be buried before Shabbat. And we had quite a rush to be able to somehow get Shabbat in on time. One of my neighbors at the entry of Shabbat, who's Sephardic, said, I want to tell you something. When Rav Ovadia Yosef's son, Rav Yaakov Yosef, who was a tremendous scholar and person, in his way, okay, similar to the two great people that I mentioned who passed away this week. The eulogy that Rav Ovadia Yosef gave was the following. He said that there is a tradition from the Ari that anyone who dies on Erev Shabbat after midday and is buried before Shabbat, they go straight to the Garden of Eden. There's no sense of a tribunal that judges them and then decides what their fate will be. And then what he said, and he was speaking then about his son, that type of end is reserved only for completely righteous people. And only then did I realize the magnitude of who I was married to. As I said, she will not be written up in the newspapers. But I think in the end, perhaps her impact on many, many people would be more profound than all the makers and shakers. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.